All right, is this working? Just making sure. Looks like the audio is working, but always good to check these things, right? Great. Good. How's everyone doing? So just a heads up, next week I'm going to be at a conference, so probably not going to be able to stream. I guess that also lines up with the PTCS now that I think about it. So I suppose I can't win that either because obviously this time around the winning strategy involves a lot of micro. But I mean, actually, maybe that's a good thing to discuss. I guess I haven't seen as much discussion of that yet. Uh, so obviously, I'm not part of the discussion on the main Discord or anything like that. Has there been any discussion about kind of the fact that you just need to micro because you can't put a 9-man rotation in? Or like, has there been any discussion of a patch for that? I'm just thinking. I mean, I certainly haven't seen one, uh, and I know there have been a bunch of other, weird issues that got introduced with the stamina changes. Uh, but this obviously seems like the most critical one, because basically it means that if you can micro and run a 9-man rotation and your opponent can't, you're basically winning once you get to round two. Um, okay, you haven't. All right. All right. I'm a little surprised. I guess I would have thought that that had become pretty apparent. So, all right. Well, something to keep an eye out for. I'm still really hoping that they actually decide to patch some of these things. And there are a few of them, right? So even the knuckleballer thing, just really, anyone that plays the game enough to hear about it, okay, fine, you can adjust and it just looks weird. If you don't play the game enough to hear about it, it just looks like you're not doing well and you don't understand why. And that's just a nasty thing to do to newer players. You really, I mean, part of the reason we do streams like this too is that you kind of want to make all of this work, right? Um, so yeah. Oh, then okay. Then so has there really been no discussion of this? The 9-man rotation, I mean. I guess I'm just surprised because I thought. Uh, I guess I just assumed there would have been discussion of how they patched the stamina thing. Okay, so let's see. I'm trying to think about where to begin here. So when you look at a player in the game, let's start with it this way. So I'll just kind of load in. I probably should have picked a tournament because I guess league there are enough off days it may be tougher to show. Let me just see if I've had off days. Okay, good. I've had no off days in a while. So um, okay. So if I click on a player, here's an example. You see this rest status. So he's listed as 100% rested. And I believe where is it? Somewhere in here, is it general or hitter? I'm looking. So somewhere in here, there's a way to just kind of show the hitter fatigue. Miscellaneous. No. I thought it was in general. Could have sworn it was in general. Performance, baseball. Okay, does anybody know where I go to find basically that there's a way to just put the fatigue in one of these columns, and I just seem to be missing it now trying to do this on stream because it's not one of the ones that I normally output, and I guess I don't usually pull stats. It's definitely somewhere in here. Okay, batter fatigue. Because I can take things like the chemistry, right? Is it player performance? No. Okay, no, it's not player performance. It's just called something like batter fatigue, right? Because it's differentiated. So like if I go to the pitching ratings, right, there's stamina, but there's also a way to find the pitcher fatigue. Stats. Here it is. Okay, it's under batting stats, batter fatigue level, pitching stats. I can get starting and relief pitcher fatigue level. Okay. Here, let me stick these just on the left to make it a little bit easier to kind of see. Uh, or it's fine. I guess you can see them on the right side of the screen just as well as anywhere else. Okay, yeah, thank you, and Ryan. Yeah, so it's under stats for each. Okay. So if you look at these, right, you're going to see a few interesting things here. So one of them is you see this batter fatigue level, right? So that, for example, a lot of these are showing 100%. Aaron Judge is showing it 95% rested for me. Presumably, and you can see this is true because he's just played a bunch of days in a row without getting an off day. Okay. The implication here is essentially that 100% corresponds to having zero fatigue or full stamina, or however you want to think about it. As you drop from 100%, we know that player performance drops. And for hitters, it drops fairly quickly. So that's why we always recommend that you rest players at some very high percentage, maybe as high as 98% in some kind of builds, but probably not lower than 95 in almost any build. The same is true for pitchers, but it takes pitchers longer to get back to being sort of 100% stamina. And so, you really can't consistently keep every pitcher there. So if I look at my pitching staff, I haven't had an off day in a while. So if I show the same thing for pitching, yeah, you'll see that as a reliever, only 3 of my players would be at 100%, one of whom's actually a starter. And as a starter, again, only 3 players would be at 100%. Okay, and interestingly, all of them would be at 100% if we make them a hitter. One of the things that's surprising, and if you want to understand how stamina works, I'd encourage you to experiment a little bit with this. Notice that for these hitters, these are showing 60% fatigue as pitchers rather than 100%. Okay. Aaron Judge, on the other hand, it's a little bit different. You see, he's at 75% batter fatigue. And you notice that his starting pitcher and relief pitcher fatigue have actually also dropped below 60. But in any event, it's kind of funny that it's 60, right? Because you could imagine taking one of these players. So I guess I cannot make this a two-way player. All right, let me think if there's a tournament build that I have that has someone I can make a two-way player. Probably not at the moment. Yeah, I don't have any of the two-way cards to demonstrate this. But there are a few things you'll notice here. One of them is that there is actually this link between hitting and pitching fatigue. And this is something that I imagine is designed to affect two-way players, but of course is implemented in a way that it affects all of them. Another thing you notice is this 60% rather than 100%, which is interesting. Now, to be completely fair, okay, if it turns out that I ever get into a point where I'm forced to bring one of these hitters in as an emergency pitcher, because I've really run through my whole pitching staff, it really doesn't matter whether they're at 60% or 100% fatigue. The game is still clearly lost and they're still clearly not going to be effective. But my understanding of this is that they would behave as if they're at 60% fatigue, not 100% fatigue. Uh, and this is also something that's related to the changes that have been made to stamina recently. So in the past, the way it would work then is that when you pitched, basically every time you pitched, that would lead to some fatigue. So let me take an example of somebody kind of in the middle here. Okay, right. So you see that Nolan Ryan here, 5 days ago he threw 43 pitches. Yesterday he threw 9 pitches. Okay. So in the past, what this would typically have meant is having thrown 9 pitches yesterday, you see he's at 86% rested. And something to keep in mind when, for the rest of this discussion is this number would be different if he had not thrown 5 days ago. So even though for a starter, for example, there's essentially this 5-day window, if that 43 were a 0 and he had thrown 9 pitches yesterday, you would expect to see a higher number. So there's more history that's being kept here than you might realize, okay? And what's then happening is that basically as as these pitchers recover, they go up in stamina. But there's a limit because you wouldn't expect that throwing 9 pitches yesterday would be a significant difference, okay? But notice that although Nolan is at 86% as a reliever, he would only be at 38% as a starter. For Al Hrabosky, who now that I think about it, I have no idea why he is still on this roster, and I should fix that build some point off stream, but that's what I get for not paying attention to the league. But for Al, okay, you see again, 12 pitches yesterday, 21 4 days ago, 84% rested. But if you try to make him a starter, he would be at 5%. Whereas for comparison, Max Manning, who threw 110 pitches yesterday, would be at 4% as a starter, but 2% as a reliever. So he'd actually somehow be higher as a starter than a reliever. And that's true of a couple of the starters I have. Dave Stieb, same thing, higher as a starter than reliever. And this is again kind of a change basically that's been made where what happens is that starting pitcher fatigue, instead of recovering in the way it has in the past, the decision that was made a few weeks ago was basically to hard code something so that no matter how few pitches you threw, and even if it were sort of historically unjustified. So for example, in 1927, I found a way to get a supposed starter to only throw 40 pitches and then get taken out of the game by a combination of a very short batter's faced hook, and then, this was a pitcher with essentially no stuff and a ton of control. So he was pretty much throwing the ball down the middle. He got through his 18 batters faced in 40 pitches and got out of the game. Even 3 days later, he was still under 70% as a starter because essentially it had been hard-coded that only on the 4th day in 1927 are you allowed to return to 100%. Okay? So this is the substance of the changes that are made to stamina. And the key point here is that not only, do starting and relieving stamina have different calculations they did in the past, but starting stamina has this hard-coded reset, whereas relief stamina does not. Okay. And the second really important thing is from a bit of testing, what I've found is that when the stamina resets, it seems to reset to exactly 100%. Okay. Now, wait a minute. What do you mean exactly 100%? Isn't that simply full stamina? No. Stamina can go above 100%, and there's evidence of this from, I think, going back at least to stuff Sergeant Mushroom was doing in like PT21, but mounting evidence over the past few years that stamina can go above 100%. So one of the ways that we can see this is if you just do an experiment of basically platooning catchers, even when one would be better kind of on both sides. Uh, so rather than, so option one, you, actually that's a better way to say it. Option one, you basically take a catcher and you bench him anytime he's under 100%. Option two, um, you simply put a catcher on an every second day rotation so that he always gets a full off day. You set things so that the other catcher can never be pinch hit for, and so forth. You set him in, basically he never comes in the game. So he always gets a rest day every time. Uh, the second catcher will perform better. So the point is, although stamina is capped at 100% for the display, stamina can go above 100%. Players who are above 100% stamina basically end up doing better than players that are at 100% stamina. Much in the same way that players at 100% stamina do better than players that are less than 100% stamina. So that means there's an advantage to playing players that are above 100% stamina. Okay, so now this creates kind of a bit of a problem though, because as I mentioned, stamina has this hard reset, but it seems to be a hard reset to 100% rather than to maximum stamina. So what we'd really like to do is we'd like to find a way to be running our players at more than 100% stamina if at all possible, right? And so one way to do this would simply be to find a way to get your players extra rest after they are reset to 100% stamina. And that should then get them above 100. So just give them the extra days of rest. And the truth is, this isn't even unprecedented, right? We know in real life baseball that giving pitchers extra days of rest does improve their performance. So it isn't unreasonable to kind of imagine that extra days of rest, in a sandbox environment would do the same thing. Okay, but now if we're trying to do this, well, can we? Can you find a way to get your players this extra rest? So doing that means two things. Number one, what is the most starters that you can actually fit on a roster? Understanding that you cannot bring them in as a relief pitcher in the interim, because if you bring them in as a relief pitcher in the interim, that's going to kind of trigger these same resets and you lose all of the effect. So you really need them to be starting pitchers. Okay. And number two, obviously anybody that's a pitcher is taking up the roster spot of somebody that could be a hitter. So, it's been typical in the past to try to run 14 hitters, 9 starters, 5 bench players who should have a role in a platoon or something. Okay. But there are two things that have changed that a bit. The first is several of the metas right now are extraordinarily strongly right-handed, and maybe even more so in some of these early eras. And so the more we have this very right-handed meta, the more that instead of starters and platoons, you're thinking about running, versus righty starters and backup versus righty starters. I do think this also means there's an opportunity to kind of try to run lefty starters if you can find enough in some of these tournaments, right? But basically, it means that you don't have to worry as much about platoons. And so therefore, instead of asking how many platoons can I squeeze in a roster, what I really kind of want to be asking is what is the smallest bench that I can come up with that will still keep everybody rested? And normally I would have thought the answer to this would be 4. You need a backup catcher that's going to, we can just add up by position is maybe one way to think about it, right? You need a backup catcher that's playing at least every third day, occasionally a little bit over, right? So close to 40, so that's close to 40% of a position. You need, And remember that especially in a long tournament, you're going to have, especially in a long tournament, you're basically going to have, you know, a bunch of long series with no off days. In a best of nine, you're not going to win that tournament without at some point playing two best of nine series back to back without any rest. So, okay, we can start to add it up, right? So catcher is going to be, let's say, zero point 0.4 of a position. Maybe zero point 0.1 of a first baseman. This assumes we never pinch hit, by the way, which you really have to assume that we will want to pinch hit sometimes, even if it's a same-sided pinch hitter. Just, putting a good first base, bench bat in for your number nine hitter or something like that, right? But okay, so second base, probably about zero point 0.3 of a position, or really maybe the infield in total adds up to about one position, right? Between second, third, and short, something like that. And similarly, the outfield, especially because of center, adds up to about one position. So maybe the minimum that you could get away with, if you're lucky, is 2.5 positions. But to make those 2.5 positions work, you never get to pinch hit, you never get a defensive replacement, you never get to pinch run, and all of your players have to be really flexible positionally because your backup catcher probably has to occasionally play in some other positions as well. So that's why really 13's always been considered the minimum. So if that's the case, the biggest pitching staff you can run is 13. You can't really get away with bullpens smaller than 6 to 7, probably really 7. Especially because you can blow out the bullpen easily with one long extra inning game in one of these long series. So that means the maximum you can run is a 6-man rotation, and 6 isn't really enough to take advantage of this effect, right? So everything. Oh, I have a comment. Yeah, so everything just loses, right? Um, so that's not a solution, except that they introduced another stamina bug, which we showed on stream last week. So I showed you an example of a situation in which I think Darren Erstad was the player I showed you, and there was maybe Hank DeBerry as well. You can find kind of the VOD of that from last week. We had a player that was on 97%, and therefore, based on my settings, rests. He's also not allowed to be a pinch hitter when tired, according to the checkbox. But he still came in the game as a pinch hitter. He pinch hit for a plate appearance, and then he was pulled. Although he's the verse righty guy, he was pulled against another righty. So he came in basically in the 8th and was pulled again in the 9th when the slot came up again. So how do you get that behavior? Right? How is it the case that a player who can't pinch hit when tired, is too tired to start, is then allowed to pinch hit, and then gets pinch hit for? Okay. Well, I suspect the answer is again kind of a bug introduced by this, or at least a change introduced by this stamina. Because when he rests, resting is enough to get him back up to 100% there. That's the whole point of resting him. And I think the change that's been made is that rest is now happening pre-game instead of post-game. So pre-game, he got his rest, he hit 100%, okay, because he's not playing. But now when the decision was made about pinch hitting, well, now he's not tired, and so the checkbox that says he can't pinch hit when tired no longer applies. After all, he's at 100%, he's on the bench, he's your best hitter for the spot, so he comes in and pinch hits. Okay, but now that he came in and pinch hits, now this means he has played all of those days in a row. So he gets fatigued, and so he then gets pulled because he's now tired. And that's the best explanation I have for this behavior. But here's the thing. When we looked at afterward, we also found that at the end of this whole thing, even though he pinch hit and was tired coming into the game, he actually recovered to 100% the next day and was able to then start the next 6 games. So what I think this means is that there are going to be micro tricks that you can play, with this pinch hitter idea, where you can basically find ways to both put players in the game and still have them calculated as resting. And with a few experiments, I think you can get this down as low as a 10-man set of hitters. I've certainly been able to do experiments where I can run 12 and I can have no off days and have no problems. But I know of at least an improvement that can get me from 12 to 11. And I'm pretty sure 10 is going to be possible. Okay, well, if 10 is going to be possible, that means I could run 16 pitchers. And that means I can run a 9-man rotation. And the great thing about a 9-man rotation is that all of these people are going to be recovering over 100% stamina. And if you work out kind of how big the effect is compared with the difference between rosters, at least in principle, it should be enormous. The problem is I haven't found a way to do this without microing, because what you need to do is you need to really make it behave like a rotation. So you need the players that are resting to rest. You really want it to be strict because the game's going to think that your number one starter is ready to start day 5, or game 6. But you don't want him starting game 6. You don't want him starting again until game 10. And there's no current option to do this. You can run a 6-man rotation with a strict rotation order, but that's as far as you can go. So I think that means to execute this strategy, you need a lot of micro, but that if you can successfully do this, you're going to have a big advantage over somebody running the same lineup that isn't playing with fatigue this way. I don't think any of these behaviors are intended. And I've said as much, and obviously I'm not the person that they're most likely to listen to when it comes to thinking about game design. But I don't think these behaviors are intended. I certainly don't think these are the historical behaviors either, although there's maybe is a little bit more of an argument for that. I suspect that if you offered major league teams, the ability to put 16 pitchers on the pitching staff, they would strongly consider running an 8 or 9-man rotation, or maybe running their top starter, every 6th day, but running the others in a longer rotation or something like that. So it wouldn't shock me actually if this is something about the direction baseball's headed, particularly with some of the low stamina players, that we're seeing in OTP, right? So it's not completely clear to me this is historically weird, but I also don't think this is the behavior that you really want, or to put it another way, when it was discovered that running a 4-man rotation in the modern era was effective, the choice by the game designers was basically to explicitly ban it with this sort of he doesn't have it effect that was introduced. So it's therefore, given that there seems to be a desire to kind of force people to run a particular strategy, which, for me in a sandbox game, I don't like as much, but given that that seems to be the desire, it's hard for me to imagine that there's really this intent to kind of encourage us to run like a 9-man staff or a 9-man rotation. But probably that's what we should be doing at the moment if we have enough time to micro. 6 is probably not a big enough effect to really make it work. It probably does have to be bigger. But if anyone can figure out a way to do this, without, having to micro, it would be really interesting. Um, I guess one possibility is you can use daily lineups, I suppose, to kind of hard code a 7-man rotation, except it's not exactly a rotation, right? It's you pitch this day of the week, so that you'd always have a Tuesday starter. But then if a series ends early, whoever's days get skipped just get skipped. Um, yeah. The other weird effect here, though, is this same effect basically says that the value of getting off days, if you sweep your first round opponent in a best of 9 and get those 4 off days, essentially in round 2 you are operating on the extra rest, right? So there's going to be an enormous advantage to building up those buys. In the past, the advantage of building up a buy was you got to reset your rest, but an opponent that had a really well constructed roster, it was more a way of stopping you from getting into trouble. So if you had a build that wasn't resilient enough to avoid getting into trouble, if you played a lot of games in a row, the rest always let you reset. And so it was an advantage if you had rest and your opponent didn't, and your opponent had that kind of roster. But if you had a roster that was well constructed and could survive, long periods of no off days, then it was just fine. But this says even with a well constructed roster, something similar is going to be the case. Anyway, I guess that's a longer answer to your question, Weirzy, than maybe you had been asking for. But I sort of feel like this is the implication of where things are going with the stamina issues. I'm not quite sure what the right solution is. Well, in my view, the right solution is very clear, which is I don't think this is the intended behavior. And I don't think the choices that were made, kind of with stamina, um, were made with this in mind. And so I would just roll them back if I were designing the game. I don't think they've made the game better anyway. I think they've made it less sandboxy and less historical in the early eras. But if you're not going to roll them back, then the other change that you could make would simply be to make the maximum stamina the maximum display stamina of 100%. And that would also avoid these kinds of effects, right? But as long as those two things aren't true, we're going to be in this situation, at least on some level. Anyway, maybe we should go on and look at some cards. Trying to think if there's anything else this week. I thought this was going to be like a shorter intro. Um, the other thing, if you're kind of looking into these issues that you should be aware of, is that knuckleballers also seem to be bugged, and there's been no discussion that I've seen of actually fixing that. But essentially, the knuckleball is being treated as a non-pitch. Seems to be the best model. I think Christophorus had a kind of had a good argument that that's what was happening. So that if you have 3 pitches as a starter but one's a knuckleball, you're being treated as a starter with 2 pitches and therefore somebody that should be in the bullpen. Sort of in the same way that the live Clay Holmes is not a starter. So Skyward, so just to say, when you say you don't understand the knuckleball, do you mean you don't understand why they didn't patch it, or do you mean you want me to explain more what the issue is? Just to clarify. Because I agree with you, I don't understand why it hasn't been patched. I would have thought this was the sort of thing that's pretty clearly an issue, pretty patchable, like easily, but also quite important at the start of the cycle, because there seems to have been an effort to release more knuckleballers than usual at the start of the cycle in order to have this Tim Wakefield mission. So there actually are a lot of knuckleballers in metas for things, right? Yeah, exactly. They open the game with a bunch of knuckleball pitchers, basically because of this Wakefield mission, which I think is a fun idea. Um, but then even more so, this is the time in the cycle where knuckleballers are featured the most. So, this is the time in the cycle when you most want to uh, get them right. You know, so anyway, remember to enter. Just 'cause I noticed one finished. Draft is good. Okay. All right. Well, why don't uh, why don't we try to get through some cards? Like I said, I hadn't intended this to be quite as long of an intro. Trying to think if there's any other news or stuff that if there's any other stuff people wanted me to discuss from this week, let me know. I'm happy to do so. But otherwise, we have 27 cards, so it's not a huge set. Um, Kenny Lofton. Okay, so yeah, I saw there's been some discussion of this Kenny Lofton card, which I don't own, and actually maybe I should buy one just to be able to show the side by side comparison. But oh, I guess he's in a mission too. All right, it's one of these pack missions. So if I buy him, I get what do I get? Get two standard packs for buying him. That's not exactly worth it. All right, I'll wait a little while on buying him. But the point is, this is what the card looks like. Um, and I guess the discussion really that came up was whether he should play in league, right? Okay. So let me sort of start out by pointing out a couple of the differences between league and tournaments, which is basically that in tournaments, the ratings, roughly are what you see is what you get. But in league, things get normalized, and they get normalized in a way that essentially tries to keep the league looking Major League Baseball like, regardless of what happens. So, one way to say it is if you have, say, a cap tournament, then basically, when peak Babe Ruth faces, 40 overall Iron Scrub, peak Babe Ruth is going to do really, really well. But in league, if you ran sort of only Babe Ruth-like hitters against only Iron Scrubs, you wouldn't get sort of Moonball, but rather the game tries to normalize things to keep the overall results just looking as much like baseball as possible. Okay. And so one of the things this means is that in a tournament, basically the performance of a card just comes down to, let's say, if I want to know how Lofton's going to do in a tournament, all I need to know is what are Lofton's ratings, what are the ratings of the pitcher he's facing. Oh, hey, Deepak. Sorry, I'm catching up on chat. Yeah, what are Lofton's ratings? What are the ratings of the pitcher he's facing? And then, anything about era and park and, those kind of modifiers, right? But once you tell me those things, I should be able to calculate how Lofton will do against that pitcher, right? And for Lofton, it's a slightly imbalanced card, so it's a very BABIP and contact heavy card, very good bunt for hit, and then of course the defense, right? When you ask the same question in league, however, because of this idea that we sort of always want to have, say, about the right number of home runs, what happens is it matters. For example, if I want to know how many, home runs Kenny Lofton's going to hit, I take this 31 and 69 power, and I compare that with the distribution of power across the league. And without knowing the distribution of power across the league, I can't actually predict how he's going to do. So, one way to say it is that, for example, if you look at this 106 outfield range, That's important because if I go and look at fielding ratings, let's save the view. No. Um, let's say I go look at outfield range. Okay. So Kiermaier is at 107% with a similarly really high quality defensive profile. Okay. Cameron, 105, okay. But all of these, Kiermaier's a gold, right? Cameron's a gold. None of these are really meant to be league cards for the most part, right? Torrey Hunter's at 102. He's probably the first one that at release might be playing in league as one of the live mission cards, although now in the higher end leagues, he really shouldn't. Ashburn is at 101. So first thing you want to ask when kind of thinking about like what did their defensive value look like, is basically what do those 5 points of range look like? And so in a tournament, it's pretty straightforward to figure out what 5 points of range are. And like a good heuristic is that each point of range is basically one extra ball the center fielder is going to get to over the course of a full season, meaning like a full, 600 plate appearance type season or something. So I don't mean a tournament because the typical tournament's a lot shorter. And if you're talking about a center fielder, typically that's cutting off an extra base hit if they catch it. So you'd expect Lofton in a tournament to be maybe 5 runs better defensively over the course of a season. Okay. But in league play, that now depends on the distribution of all of these center fielders. So you notice that my Ashburn is actually negative 2.5 runs of ZR right now as a center fielder. And if we look at the Loftons in my league, you notice, okay, as an example, this one's about +4, right? You could look at a few others, but, that one's all the way up to +8. So the gap between Ashburn and Lofton defensively right now has gone way up. Or to put it another way, if the only center fielders in the league are either Lofton or Ashburn, then you might see that there's like a 20 run a season gap or something between them defensively. Well, that's 2 wins. That's a big enough difference that Lofton likely would become the better player. Okay, but that's also really strongly dependent on exactly what people are running, because both Lofton and Ashburn are actually kind of excellent defensive center fielders, compared with some of the bat first options that people might be running. And similarly, as additional players come into the meta. So for example, if we look at, Cool Papa, right? He's at 101. So basically the same range as Ashburn, right? So I think the point is you could imagine that there would be a league where basically 101 is the low center fielder and 106 is the high center fielder. And in a league that is that heavily compressed, I could imagine that Lofton is 2 wins better defensively, and that's probably enough to make up for the difference in bats. Ashburn pretty clearly should have a little bit better bat. Although, again, I say pretty clearly, but maybe not as obviously as it looks in all cases, because if you look at Ashburn, he also has a very imbalanced bat, right? He has 0 power. So he's getting his value from this enormous eye. That's the primary place that his value is coming from relative to Lofton. They both, do reasonably well with the avoid Ks and BABIP. Ashburn has a lot less power. Lofton has a lot less eye. But Lofton doesn't have a lot of power. But the thing is that right now, there are a fair number of low power cards being run in some leagues. So, if you end up a little bit later in the cycle and you're running in a league where all of the hitters have 100 to 180 power, kind of like they did late in the cycle last time, then Lofton's power in the 50s and Ashburn's power of 28 are basically both identically worthless. They're both a bunch of standard deviations below the mean. But currently, there are some low power cards being run. Like if I look at, yeah, so if I look at, sort of my team, for example, I'm also running Vargas, who has this very low power. You know, Keith Hernandez has more power than Lofton, but not an enormous amount more power than Lofton. He's on a bunch of these teams, right? Um, so the more cards like that stick in the meta, um, the more Lofton's power would become a little bit less worthwhile. So I guess what I'm trying to say is when you have two cards of different shapes like that, um, you can imagine a league situation where some of their strengths basically get maximized or minimized, and you could get a surprising result. Um, in a tournament, it seems clear that Ashburn's going to be a significantly stronger card. In League, if the League kind of spans the whole set of things that you find in, broad, let's say that you took a League from an open cap, so you really just have everything from top to bottom. Again, I think it would be very clear in that scenario that Ashburn's much better, right? Okay. However, I think you could design a league for almost any pair of cards like this, where some ratings are better and some ratings are worse, right? Um, I think you could design a league uh, where you could make one of the cards better and the other worse. And that's one of the reasons that, if you're really trying to think about how you optimize, say, for Perfect League, that you can't just use a card database to do it the way I'm running here, but you do also have to get a pretty good idea of what the player pool looks like, because exactly which players those 40 teams are running matter. And the 40 teams in Perfect League are going to be running a much narrower set of players than than the 40 teams in a lower level league. So in the lower level league, you can treat it a little closer to a tournament, at least just because you're going to get a big spread of players. But it would surprise me if you're seeing more than about 3 different center fielders being run in Perfect League right now as primary center fielders. I mean, I'm trying to think, right? So some people would run Ashburn, some people would run Bell, some will run Lofton, it sounds like. And there's not too much else, right? I mean, you could run McCutcheon one way, but I'm thinking about verse right. You could run Shoeless Joe, I guess, but I think I would just much rather run him in right and run the better glove in center. Okay. Now there's one other, sorry, Peter, I'll come back and think about that too. There's one other significant confounding factor here. And this is part of the problem in answering a question like this as well. As people that have been playing with this for a while have come to realize, Out of the Park's defensive stats are wrong. So when Out of the Park says, okay, here's my Richie Ashburn, he has negative 2.5 runs of ZR and negative 1.1 runs of ARM, that's demonstrably incorrect. What's correct seems to be more difficult. Again, I'd point you to some of the stuff Sergeant Mushroom did. I think Yukun Kazami, I think some of her stuff may have had some experiments with this a few years ago as well, maybe. Maybe Franchise Time Machine did one of these. Okay, one running Harry Rice. That's that. Okay. That's a little surprising. Davis, I could see if that's, if you just never invested in center and you kind of did that mission. Um, yeah, so I think the point though is you could imagine a situation where you could make Lofton better than Ashburn in exactly the right league. Uh, it would have to be kind of exactly the right league. Um, Whether the perfect league meta happens to match that right now, it's a little tough for me to say. Um, but I guess so the more Eric Davises there are, the better it is for Ashburn. Because basically the situation in which Lofton's going to become really interesting is going to be the situation where Lofton's 106 is the best center field outfield range, and Ashburn's 101 is the worst. When both of those two things are true, that's basically the situation where Lofton becomes viable. And let's see, what is McCutcheon? McCutcheon's 97. Okay, so the more McCutcheons you see, again, the better that is for Ashburn, right? Um, yeah. So I think that's the point. Could there be a situation where Ashburn's worse than Lofton? It would have to be the kind of situation I just described, but it's possible that we're actually pretty close to that. And so that's where collecting some data would help. I'd be surprised if we're really there, simply because I would expect that there are enough good power hitters that that Ashburn's bat ends up a lot better than Lofton, because I think you need Lofton to be getting some value from the power, right? Yeah, Mr. Black, exactly. That it's really important to sort of be, the best or the worst in a rating for a league. And so if it really turns out that Lofton's the best and Ashburn's the worst defensively, then I can see the argument for thinking about Lofton. Uh, but that not only would that situation change if a better defensive center fielder comes out, but the situation would also actually change if a worse defensive center fielder becomes popular. So, for example, if next week we were to get, a big clubhouse shop card, which is, say, an Oscar Charleston who, has better range than Lofton in center, it would also mean that the remaining Loftons probably then become a lot worse than the remaining Ashburns, because you're sort of compressing them together in center field defense. And similarly, if we see, some, big mission card that's just a bat first center fielder, that has, maybe only 90 or 95 range, but is center field only and the bat's so incredibly good you have to play him, that would also actually hurt Lofton relative to Ashburn. So I guess what I'm saying is that, without collecting data, um, I think I'd have to say it's possible that you could create a situation where it's true. Um, so if someone's showing you that in data, it's at least a possibility. Um, but in a tournament, I think it's much more clear. In a tournament, I don't think you need a lot of data to be able to tell that Ashburn's going to be the better card. Even if it's Seawit, I mean, I obviously Seawit has his strong opinions about things, right? I don't think I don't think I've ever seen him to be lying about the data he collects. So I think if he's showing you data, I think you can assume that it's the data he's collecting. Um, I definitely disagree with a lot of his conclusions from the data, but I I think I trust that he's honestly giving you both his best data and his best conclusions, I just reach other ones a lot of the time, if that kind of makes sense. Um, and by the way, if there's anyone that's kind of collecting data or just generally reaching different conclusions than I am about this stuff, whether it's Seawit or someone in chat or kind of anyone else, I'm happy to have them on stream and discuss some of these things. Um, you know, I think that's part of how there's nobody that has all of the answers with this stuff. So, uh, they're always kind of interesting conversations, and I'm always happy to have discussions in good faith with people where I disagree. Um, you know, we actually had a lot of fun joining D Block on stream a couple of weeks ago, and I know we often disagree on kind of our approach to things like roster building or something, but that's fine. We can have different views and still kind of have a fun conversation and talk about the things why we're doing different stuff you know and ultimately that's part of what's fun about this game is that if there's somebody where you think they're taking the wrong approach, uh, you do get to play against them and kind of find out which approach works better. And that's, I mean, to me, that's one of the things that I enjoy most about the game, and also the one where I think variants hurt it the most, because variants make it a lot more difficult. If you've invested in variants and you win, it makes it a lot more difficult to figure out if the variants if you're winning because you invested in variance or if you're winning because you found the right approach. Separating those two effects becomes quite hard. Um, but yeah, I think this game's a lot of fun when playing against people that have different views on what a baseball team should look like, and kind of getting to find out how they interact. Uh, so, you know, definitely, I hope there's more of that. Um, all right. Anything else? Oh, sorry, Pete. I saw you asking about the stamina thing again. Because that's not a number that's exposed, I don't know what the limit is to stamina that you can recover. What I do know from kind of doing the experiment is that one of the ways that you can think about it is you can try to measure it by looking at when players hit 100% in different ways, how long it takes for them to dip below 100% again, or something like that. So there are ways you can try to estimate it, I think. Um, it's maybe more doable for position players slightly, because the problem is that for pitchers, it's not just number of pitchers, it's things like leverage index and stuff like uh, that matters, right? But anyway, all right, we should probably rate some cards. Trying to think. Oh, there was actually one other fun thing that I was going to show. Maybe I just have to show it in a couple weeks. Yeah, I think we're getting a bit late because my schedule just seems to be a mess Fridays at the moment. We're getting a bit late. How many spotlight packs did I buy? Zero. Um, so generally, when spotlight packs come out, if you just kind of calculate it, you're losing points on every one you buy, and that's kind of by design, right? The idea of a spotlight pack is basically, if you buy standard packs, you'll eventually kind of hit everything, but it'll be slow, it'll take you a lot of time, and you'll have to, sell everything else to get the value back. And spotlight packs, you're basically paying a premium to have a better chance of getting new cards, but you are paying a premium to do it. So, in general, I'm a free to play player. I feel like one of the things that you want to do to survive, when you're a free to play player, is you want to avoid paying a premium for basically anything you can avoid paying it for. So I didn't buy any of the spotlights, but what I often will do is if there's a card I want in a spotlight pack, then I'm kind of happy when other people buy spotlights and sell the proceeds because it just means there are more of them in the market, right? Um, yeah, I could work out. Let me see. Actually, you know what? I might actually be able to do that really quickly. Hold on. Unless someone's done it, has somebody calculated? Where would that be? Do it that way instead. I want to grab a second window to show you this on stream. One sec. Unless has anybody already calculated like the spotlight value for this one? But yeah, if not, I can show you. I've just got a calculator that'll do it pretty quickly. Where is it? If I can find it. I used to have a calculator that could do it pretty quickly. But yeah, did anyone calculate it? All right, here let's just do that really quickly. One sec. What do we want to do here? Oh, okay. Well, for one thing, I should probably show you. Yeah, show you kind of the other spotlight calculator. All right, so spotlights. Let's just see if we can figure this out. So, um, spotlight list is in the forum, right? Yeah, so perfect team 26. Yes, okay. Spotlight packs. Okay. So there's a list of cards and odds typically pasted in the forum, right? So it's this last one, Spotlight packs. Okay. All right. So then I want to grab an updated version of the card list because I need to know how much everything costs, right? Okay. Okay. So this looks like the odds. Does that look right? So we have, yeah, we got about a 20% chance of pulling, is that right? About a 20% chance of pulling a perfect? Oh, right. They changed what column everything is in, didn't they? So let me figure out where these go first. The buy order is actually now, okay. Sorry, as you might be able to see, I haven't done this in a little while. Okay, but this shouldn't be too bad. Get to see how bad I am at spreadsheets. Isidafo used to be the one that was good at this. Okay, here we go. Good. So this is basically kind of the value of each of the ones we can pull. Okay. Based on that, it looks like the spotlight card in the pack is worth about 59,000 before tax, meaning like 53 or 54,000 after tax. And then I guess you get the other 5 cards in a historical pack that at this point are worth maybe 1,000 or something like that. So that means the fair value of a spotlight is between 55 and 60K in terms of return. Um, so yeah, if you were to buy one now, you expect to be losing points, but that's always been the idea is that you pay a bit of a premium in return for in return for those points, right? So I think in other words, I think that's the design is sort of what I'm trying to say. But yeah, it's not you know, spotlight packs are generally not good as an investment. They're good as, I want a bunch of the new cards. I don't want to deal with with the card shop, and I want to get them as quickly as possible, right? That's the idea. But of course this is true for a lot of stuff in the game, right? I mean, even when you have a new card that comes out, buying the first copy of the card comes at a premium for kind of getting it done right away as well. So I think that there are a lot of things like this in the game. You know, I generally don't, I don't buy spotlight packs. I generally wouldn't recommend people buy spotlight packs if they're trying to maximize their resources. Um, but they're probably good for me when other people buy them, right? In the same way that, for anyone else that wants to get stuff out of the card shop. Okay. So, speaking of card shop, maybe we should look at a few of these cards, right? I knew we were going to get to that at some point, was the plan. Let's see if we can look at a few of these cards. All right, so what do we got here? We've got 27 cards this week. I'll try to go through them reasonably quickly. All right. Jerry Augustine. So, okay. 44 overall. Starter, very P-BABIP heavy. Also has this big stamina. I don't think the big stamina is going to help you very much because generally you're thinking about this maybe as a cap card, and the 44 overall really isn't going to be a starter for you unless you have an extremely low cap. Uh, so the stamina probably doesn't help you so much. So what you have is let's see, a lefty with moderate splits. That's actually not so bad. I mean, especially for kind of a cheap card, having a cheap lefty is probably, a nice thing to have available for some of these caps. The main problem is we're still at the case where kind of all of these cards from a power creep point of view are behind the lives. So if we compare this, Philip Humber, the 41 overall Humber, so I'll wait for this to reload, the 41 overall Humber is a very similar card in terms of profile and everything, a little bit more balanced, probably very slightly better because of that balance, but he's just 3 points cheaper. And remember, we looked at Humber last week and we found he's also just behind all the lives. So I think this card is also going to behave similarly to Humber. He's a lefty, but you're paying 3 extra points to get him as a lefty. And he's behind a bunch of the low 40s live cards right now. So as it stands today, the card's an F. But I am going to put a little asterisk here because we're about to be getting a live update. And sometimes in the past, we've seen that live updates also change the power level a little bit, especially on one extreme end or the other. If the low 40s lives were to all get a lot weaker, this card becomes a little bit better. Yeah, Humber for 50K, that really seems tough to me because the problem is even the level 5 Humber, even the level 5 Humber probably is going to be, should be behind Michael Lorenzen live right now. Might be behind the 41 overall Kasperius. And yeah, so I think the problem is unless the lives get a lot weaker, I just think you don't want to play Humber there. Um, yeah. Although unless you get, the bugged, or no, that was Braden that had the bugged version where it just helped all your variants. So yeah, I think this one's an F, but just keep track of what happens with the update because if anything happens with the update where the low iron lives get a lot worse or something, then this does become a more interesting card. Uh, but otherwise, it doesn't. All right. Next, what do we got? We've got Paul Bird. Um, I like my control guys. This is also an interesting shape because of this really strong reverse split. And so you'd like to think that the reverse split starts to make this an interesting card out of the bullpen. Problem is, just versus lefties out of low iron starters. And at 49, he's really not a cap card. He's just a low iron card. But just, versus lefties, even out of low iron starters, he's like 23rd, it looks like. And, just the complete lack of stuff still kills him because in iron right now, 60 stuff is still getting you 5 or 6 strikeouts per 9. And so his 21 stuff really is costing him about 3.5 Ks per 9 relative to that. And it's really hard for the other stuff to make up for it enough, just because of what low iron hitters look like. Um, and then of course versus righties he's worse than that. So yeah, this one just doesn't play. It's an interesting shape, and you know I think of the kinds of cards you could introduce that don't play, introducing one that is the best card of its shape and the shape just doesn't work, I think is a much more interesting card to have. So I don't think this card is like a waste of release, but I also don't think you ever want to play it. Um, if you were to get a very early era low iron, it becomes closer, but then the problems versus righty probably still mean you don't end up playing him. Um, but at least the stuff's not going to hurt him. But I guess like even 1927 or something, you're going to run other bronzes. All right, so those are the low irons. Uh, we're just still at the point, where power creep has not allowed any of the historical iron pitchers to really break through the lives. So we're gonna have to see what happens with the update on Monday, I guess. In the meantime, what do we got? Okay, so Danny Graves. So we have at least had one, this Steve Chitrin, one reliever that kind of broke through the lives in iron. Graves, well, I should pull up the card. Yeah, Graves just isn't going to. And in fact, I'm sort of struggling to understand why this card's a 50, because the idea of making him a 50, sort of uh, seems to be kind of wanting to make it, unavailable for low iron. But this would have been a much better low iron card. It at least would have been an interesting shape. And I think he still wouldn't have played now that I look at it. But at least it would have been kind of an interesting shape, the same way that Bird was. 50, this just isn't close. I won't give him an F minus because he would play on your all Vietnam theme team. But yeah, beyond that, that's about what we can do. All right, how about Derek Dietrich? So we've had a good 40 overall Dietrich, right? Well, this just isn't it. In fact, Yeah, because these power and I cards have been getting swallowed up to begin with. And obviously this is just a verse right only card. But that means to make it work, the bat's got to be huge because this is not a good defensive card. Um, but the problem is it's also, yeah, let's see. Okay, so he obviously is going to hit for power. I mean, that's kind of the one big tool. He has decent eye for iron. But the problem is an iron DH, I've got him something like fifth at base. And several of the cards he's behind are cards uh, that also have to DH. They're at least different shapes. So if you have an iron set in like 1998, then he will jump to the top of the DH list. Uh, but just to give you an idea of what the comparison looks like, you know, this Roy Sievers is also an iron from the other side. And this is basically Dietrich with like, what, 50 or 60 points of 60 points of BABIP added, you know, from the opposite side. So unfortunately, Dietrich's just pretty far behind that, and so he's also just not going to play. Uh, there is a little window to play him, like I said, if you could get something set in the right era. So there are, for example, a couple drafts in that era, and you know, I think you would make that work. But so Jeff, that's an interesting point about a waste of release. The thing is, we already have plenty of filler cards sort of from historical packs, right? So for something like Magic the Gathering, you do have filler cards to make drafts. But it's also the case that when you like buy a pack of cards, it's only a pack from the current set. So I think if you were going to rotate out old historical cards and basically, so this wouldn't be a bad game design actually. To basically say, I think by the end of last year we had a little over 6,000 cards in the catalog. I don't think it would be bad game design to essentially say there will only be, 3,000 cards in the game at any given time. And so some will get rotated out when others get rotated in. You'd have to, people would complain about, because we did this with this Platinum set a few years ago, and the complaint was then that if you have, cards that are needed for missions, that basically this becomes a problem, right? Well, yeah, but that's the point. Is drafts generally are which ones are newer anyway. So the point is similarly here, right? If you're comparing Dietrich with most launch irons that you can draft, Dietrich, just because of power creep, is going to have a bit more value. So this is, especially in the 90s, is a draftable card. But it's not a card you want to construct, construct a deck with, basically, if that's the way you want to think about it. All right, anyway, let's go on and look at some bronzes, see if we're doing a little better. All right. Wayne Granger. So first off, if nothing else, just by eye, there are some more points on this card. It's a flatter profile than it looks, apart from sort of the PBABIP. Yeah, so it's funny, actually, I've never run into, because it's a closer in 1972, huh? I don't think I had run into him before, just thinking about like historically in baseball, and that's still on the real early side. I would have thought for a closer, so that's interesting. Um, Wait, okay. Now I'm really confused. So 1972 was basically The worst season of his career. That's interesting because I guess the idea of this set was cards that had an excellent May, right? Um, so I guess he must have had just an excellent May in the middle of what otherwise was, yeah, that's what it was. He had an excellent May in the middle of what otherwise was, the worst year of his career. Hmm. Okay. Oh, that's a fun story to see then. Anyway, as for the card, so yeah, now we're up to bronze, and it still had been the case that in bronzes the lives were generally ahead of the historical cards for pitchers, and this is kind of getting close. So I now have this as about the third or fourth best live reliever that's listed as a reliever. A little bit worse than that if you include the converted starters. But I think the point is with this and kind of the next card or two that we're going to talk about, we're now at the point where the historical cards are starting to beat the lives. And again, we can come back and revisit this in a few days because we may find that sort of the power level of the lives changes in the update. But for the moment, this is sort of a fringy reliever. There certainly are cards that have more. There are also a couple really weird shapes. I mean, I think by far my favorite, just as an interesting experiment to draft, if nothing else, is this Danny Young. If you ever get to face lefties, this is. I mean, the funny thing is, if you really could guarantee that you could use him as a lefty specialist, the way normalization works, I wouldn't hate taking a shot at putting this card in League in the right situation. I mean, it doesn't, right? But this is a card where, depending on what the live re-rate does, it could be really interesting. Actually, what is he doing with the live re-rate? Let me see what his stats actually are showing, and if they're this extreme. All right, 13 strikeouts in 8 1/3, 3 walks, no home runs, 1 hit by pitch. Struck out 13 of 37 batters faced. And big gap between the 4.32 ERA and the 1.38 FIP. So given that FIP is closer to how players get re-rated here, it would be interesting if this card gets a little bit of a boost. It might be interesting to kind of see if you could make it work as a specialist or something. Okay, that'll be a fun one to keep an eye on in the re-rate. Anyway, as for Granger, he's more balanced. So the card's probably like a C. You can play him. He's also eligible for low bronze, which is that little bit better. Yeah, so you can play him, but but he's not going to be a critical card or anything. But we are now getting to the point the historicals start to beat the lives. All right, then we got Ron Hunt. All right, let's see. So mostly versus lefty. Says he's a second baseman, but he's really a third baseman, which makes sense from the couple of these we've seen in the past. So third baseman versus lefty already is going to be a little bit tricky because I'm going to try to count who the highest lefty. Yeah, it looks like my 24 highest starters right now in bronze are all righties. Bronze is incredibly, incredibly right-handed. And so that means, at least on release, this is basically a card that doesn't have somewhere to go. And that's clearly going to hurt him. But the things that are going to hurt him more are that they're just release cards that are incredibly splitty here. So, Like you would just rather run this Pump C Green as your verse left option, and it's not even anywhere close. Um, and it's not a great comparison. I mean, Phil Linz similarly is sort of the more glove heavy version that's, you know, does the same thing. Uh, there's just no room for cards like Ron Hunt until you can get to the point that power creep puts them ahead of something like Pumpsy or Linz. That's probably just going to be a while. So it's not an F minus. I mean, you would definitely play this at a level below Green and Linz, but you're never doing this in bronze, and you're especially never doing this in bronze when there are no lefties. Uh, so yeah, I think that one's probably just not going to work. All right, Johnny Mustel. All right, so another verse left card. So some of the discussion we just had, is going to apply here too, right? If there aren't any lefties, there's no room in the meta for the VL option. But taking that aside, by making him an outfielder now with a decent glove, he's not competing with Pumpsy Green. Phil Linz is actually eligible to play center, and is going to have kind of the decent bat as well. But this is actually a good center fielder defensively. So this is a good enough center fielder defensively if there are both lefties and righties in the bronze meta, then this card should play. Right now, there just aren't. And so I think that probably makes him something like a D, because by the time lefties get printed, maybe he's already power crept out. But, so I don't think I'm actually ever going to run this card in a roster, most likely, just given how few lefties there are. But he is the best at his position versus lefties, so I really want to give him something other than an F at least. All right, Cody Ross. All right, 89 range, 3-position outfielder, has a fair bit of power both ways. I mean, this is actually the Derek Dietrich bat. It's just Dietrich now on both sides and a real defensive outfielder. So which is why this is a bronze instead of, kind of a iron. But we've seen that sort of all of the cards of this shape just are getting swallowed up. The one place that a card like this starts to have value is in a low cap where that power can beat up on some low irons. So I think this is again a card where in some drafts you might find that this is a draftable card, but it's hard for me to see a constructed thing where he ends up anywhere better than kind of between 5th to 10th. And you just would rather kind of play the better outfielders, I think. Yeah, I think there's no way to make this one work. All right, and then Mario Soto. So last option here. Well, you're saying center field options are limited in bronze, but the problem is that the ones that they're limited to are also two-way options and also giving you more. Right? So a card like this, Jerry Benjamin, has sort of all the tools other than power and the 97 range. I think you'd rather look at that. Norris Hopper, again, it's sort of the power mainly that he's missing, but, still ends up being a solid bat. And then you start to look at the ones that, play the one side or the other as well. So like this Billy Hamilton on one side, you're getting the 103 range in return for kind of the, this playable bat. Homer Smoot's the opposite. This is sort of the bat with a little more power that just you're sticking in center field, hoping nothing too bad happens and playing the bat, right? So I think there are enough options that uh, I don't think you're going to run out, basically. And there are enough of these that are two-way options that have better bats that this one probably just doesn't play. But I think you can. I think you can certainly draft him. Uh, all right, then we got Mario Soto. Um, so really BABIP heavy with some stuff. So this is a shape that wouldn't have worked last year, but works a little better this year. Uh, and I do have this one as being quite strong. So there's no really good direct comparison to the shape, but probably the closest shape here is this live heel. Yeah. So this is probably the closest shape to Soto. And this is a card that, you know, since release, I've kind of been running, as alive as one of these kinds of options. He's kind of been at least fringy meta. Uh, but Soto has extra points, in several places compared with Heal. So this really should be, I think one of your starters. The other thing is, although there are some splits here, basically all of these righties have pretty significant splits. This is actually one of the less splitty righties that we have in bronze right now. So I think when you put those two things together, there's probably like a solid B or something. I mean, I think this should be in your rotation. Uh, maybe even more like a B plus, actually. The more I think, yeah, because there aren't that many really splitty cards. So I think this is one that you're gonna want to have somewhere. All right, good. On to silvers. Way behind the timing I was hoping for here. All right, Benji Molina. So you probably know what I'm going to say by now, which is, that okay, the catcher framing's 85, and the models tend to really, really like these. At least the ones I've got tend to really, really like these heavily defensive catchers, and this one's not so good. But the truth is, um, this is a really good bat for what you're getting. And on both sides, this is kind of by far your best catcher bat, not just in low silver, but even in full silver. So just as the Jose Molina, was this huge defensive catcher that also has a little bit of a bat and that you can run pretty high, this is the more offensive version, but this is a really good offensive catcher. Uh, it's still not a good offensive card for a non-catcher. So, it's not a DH or anything, but you're at least getting credible defense. And I do have this, as a result, jumping to the top both ways as a catcher. So even beating a couple of the ones with big splits, like the Ozzie Virgil versus left or something, that have been playing up maybe. So this feels like a really solid card. I think it is, it's not only is it playing up into full silver. I wonder, okay, so it's not going to play into full gold because there are just a couple of these really strong mission rewards, I guess. Is it going to play into low gold? It's a good question, right? Would it play? Yeah, I think it would, right? Maybe it's Benji and Aaron Robinson are your two, or yeah, all right. Yeah, I think this is a solid S then. Um, this just I think ends up hitting the meta really well right now. I hate these cards that have no eye because just walks are really good and getting on base is great, but oh, that's right. So the low gold is dead ball. I forgot. Okay, so in dead ball, well, this isn't a horrible dead ball shape. I mean, again, I wish he had more eye, but this is not a horrible dead ball shape. Yeah, bubbles probably would be up there. Okay. So, yeah. Yeah, I think there's a solid S then. All right. Charlie Robertson. Um, um, where are the points in this card? Yeah, I guess he has a little bit of a reverse split, but where are the points in this card? Uh, yeah, this is yeah, okay. I don't think this needs too much discussion. It's incredibly understated. This is a pretty clear F minus, right? Yeah, in the stamina rating and the hold runners. There you go. Uh, yeah. Okay. So this one I don't. That one I do think is probably just a miss, more than a filler thing, right? All right. Al Wickland. Okay, he's got eye. He's got some power. He's got some different pieces to the bat. So you know that's not bad. Um, so I still have this as reasonably far behind the meta. So in part because this is an awful glove. So you know he sort of to play really has to be good enough defensively to stick, maybe even in center with that kind of bat. And he just is pretty far behind kind of the good bat center fielders, even really in bronze. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any. Yeah, in early eras, he kind of loses the power, and then he still has the defense. Yeah, okay, this is just not going to play. Um, it's probably more of an F. I mean, it is maybe the best of its exact shape, but there's just not enough there. Um, all right, let's go on to Earl Shealy. All right, so at least the coloring immediately makes it look like there's some points here. This is a verse lefty first baseman, though, and that's going to be a problem because we're going to run into the Segui, and if not Segui, then the Jackie Robinson that we had recently. And this card, although there are a bunch of points there, it's just behind both of those two. Uh, and both of those are eligible for low silver even. So even though there are a fair number of points here, this one's still going to be an F. And in that sense, the Wickland's maybe even more interesting. Because the thing about Wickland is, as I think Jeff was mentioning. Yeah, sorry, Sheila. It's exactly. Um, yeah, as I think Jeff was mentioning, it's hard to find depth in outfield in bronze, and that's true a little bit in silver also. I'm finding like in general in drafts, outfield is the position that I struggle the most to find enough depth to kind of want to be drafting right now. So from that point of view, the more of these we find, the better. And I think Wickland, although he's really not in the meta, is actually a draftable card most of the time you see him for that reason. Shealy, I think I'm less inclined to draft, just sort of for what you're getting. All right, and then we got Johnny Bassler. I don't think we've had one of these in a few years. Um, okay, so obviously the low power, that's fine. That's kind of funny that this one power sort of on the left ends up a bigger contour than the one on the right. Um, so one power, I'm guessing that means he did not hit a home run in 1922. Uh, yep. In fact, he hit one home run for his career in 2,867 plate appearances. So, all right, I can see where the lack of power comes from. So, yeah, modern era, the lack of defense, the lack of everything else, this card just doesn't work. Um, on the other hand, in an early era, this is now a pretty interesting card, right? Because the flaws that he has, the power and the catcher defense, those flaws both entirely get masked. Um, yeah, that's true. He can also bunt, can't he? Which is nice. So he can even bunt, right? So yeah, let me see where. Okay, so versus righties, this isn't quite as good of a dead ball card as it looks. So one of the things to consider, yeah, now that I'm looking at this, see, this is why I run the model to kind of check, because here my instinct was wrong. What I wasn't thinking through clearly is how much of this value comes from this 143 and 144 avoid K. So in the early era, those also become useless. It's really the BABIP, but now it's only an 82 BABIP. So like if you look at this bat versus righties, just look at the BABIP and I and ignore everything else, like for a really early era, okay? And compare him to Benji, and he's walking a ton more than Benji, but Benji's actually getting more hits. Uh, which partly makes up for it. And of course, the catcher defense isn't worth zero, right? It's still worth something. Um, you know, so like Benji in like against one set of pitchers in 1919, I might have something like hitting 337, 353 OBP. Bassler might hit 308 with a 384 OBP. Uh, And then Bassler ends up like 3 points of WOBA ahead of Benji. But 3 points of WOBA is close enough that you are going to still prefer having some catcher defense. So yeah, actually, I guess Bassler isn't as good in an early era as I thought. He's definitely not a modern card. Yeah, okay, so I guess it's just an F. But that one definitely fooled me by eye. By eye, I would have thought this would be an excellent dead ball card. Okay, Tommy Green, who I remember from growing up in Philly. Um, really P. Babbitt heavy and otherwise very flat, huh? Um, but then I guess the problem is with that shape, he's just missing points. So, for example, like compare this, to Francis. You might be getting even a little bit more. So Tommy Green's not like completely out of it. I have him like around 20th best, but just not enough that you're going to end up playing unless the lives really all drop out. Uh, I guess the other thing I remember, so I remember Tommy Green as being an excellent hitting pitcher as well. I'm just worried. I'm just wondering if whoa, is that right? Hold on. Am I just misremembering? I remember Tommy Green as being very good hitter for a pitcher. Is this one of these like just things that like as a childhood memory you get completely wrong, I wonder. Okay. Let me check the stats on this. No, hold on. Yeah. Tommy Green in 1991, and this is a 1991 card, put up .9 WAR with his bat. 268, 307, 380. He hit 2 home runs. He had a 94 OPS plus. And yeah, the following 2 years, yeah, he had sort of a year where he was mostly injured, but then he came back and put up .8 WAR and .2 the next couple of years just as a hitter. So no, this is. I want to know where those hitting ratings come from then. Uh, yeah, this should be an excellent hitting pitcher. All right, let me see. I should ping Sporer. Yeah, yeah. Huh. Okay, yeah, he should be an excellent hitting pitcher, I think. I did remember that correctly. And all right. Well, in any event, as a pitcher, it doesn't quite work. But I think this could have been one of these fun little like sneaky two-way cards, like the Don Newcombs we've had or something. And if he had this kind of pitching and was like a sneaky two-way card, it actually would have been kind of fun. So it's too bad it didn't work out that way. Uh, but as it currently stands, I think this one just doesn't play. So, all right, let's go up and look at some of the golds. So yeah, so far I guess not that much in the set. A couple though, right? I think you definitely want Benji Molina. You want Soto. Granger is at least kind of, a card you might play. So yeah, some combination there. But not a huge list that I want so far. All right, Cy Williams. Okay, so same kind of big power, nothing else card that we've seen before versus lefties. He has that little bit of eye versus righties. We've already seen this shape kind of doesn't play unless you have a huge glove, and this one doesn't. So I think this is again going to be one of these cards where you're perfectly happy to draft him, uh, but you probably aren't gonna, you know, you aren't really gonna want to put him in a constructed roster. I do think he's going to get some play because there are some people that just sort of look at the power numbers and try it, and you'll get a sense of what that looks like. But this just isn't really that good of a bat, except in kind of a normalized situation. So if there were an equivalent of league normalization, then this would start to be an interesting bat. But without having that in tournaments, yeah, it's hard to just find a way to make this one work. Yeah, okay. All right. So that one doesn't work. How about Larry Doyle? Okay, listed at second. This is also a DH. So now the problem is a DH. This isn't anything close to a DH bat, is it? Yeah, this is not close to a DH bat. All right. Yeah, I don't understand this one. I think it's pretty clearly not gonna play unless there's some typo in here. uh, yeah, because this one's in full gold even. All right, Jeff Samardzija. All right, so a little bit more of last year's profile in that he's missing the P BABIP, but in the other three skills, although it's reasonably flat as a profile, it's now getting to a pretty strong level of flat. So with last year's model, this is, kind of very clearly just a strong card. With this year, the P BABIP really does seem to matter quite a bit more. And so, yeah, as a result, I'm having trouble finding a scenario where I can make, yeah, if I move him back earlier, the P BABIP matters even more. right? Yeah. Yeah, so even though there are a bunch of points there, I'm trying to figure out why I'm not finding him at all, though. Because no, there are enough points there that he has to he has to be able to play even without the P Babbitt. Um, all right. Oh, all right. I see the problem. You know what? I have the wrong version of the card shop that I'm running in gold. Let me go grab these again, and yeah, because this has to play for sure. There's just so many points there. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. But yeah, because that one just looked clearly okay. So there are enough points there for him to kind of work. So the card that actually he's going to be most similar to, which we know is a meta card, is this Rhett Lauder, except that Lauder has this extra these extra points of P BABIP. So he will be a little bit weaker than Lauder, but kind of in that next tier. So that makes him probably like a B minus, C plus, something like that. Um, okay. Also for Cy Williams, now that I have the correct version of the card, so he still really isn't close defensively to doing anything. You have to think about Cy basically is a DH. Uh, so it's worth mentioning. I do have him sort of about fifth uh, versus righties. So getting to the point that he's still not your top DH, but I think if you were to put him in the right park, if you were to put him in kind of a 1990s Coors type thing, then that home run power plays up enough that probably there's a little bit of a role for him. So I think instead of an F, maybe we want to give him more like a D minus because I think you could create a role where that works. All right, we are on to low diamond. So let's see what we got here. Yeah, and yeah. Sorry about that. At least I noticed it because yeah. Otherwise, would have had to come back and correct it or something. All right. So what do we got here? Okay. Dellin Betances. Well, that one's really easy uh, because you see this card says New York Yankees. And because it's a New York Yankee, he clearly gets the Yankee, F minus, and we move on. All right, Frank Smith. Let's see. So this is similar profile, a little bit to what we saw with Samardzija. A little bit less stuff, but then more of the home run suppression and control, and a little more of the P BABIP, right? Which is, of course, why he's now up to diamond. And I guess in this case, the choice is made to make it full diamond. So he kind of has to play that little bit more up, right? Um, yeah. But by the way, Betances probably is just an F. He's an F minus because he's a Yankee. But yeah. All right. So as for Frank Smith, if he were a low diamond, I think he would be a fringy starter. Uh, at 95, you're just now competing with the Marischal and the Max Manning and Grover Cleveland and you know cards like the Hershiser and Veal that are splittier. Um, and kind of all these live missions even. Um, so that step up, I think, is enough that it's likely going to end up killing the card. Maybe not completely. for people that don't own, if you don't own every single one of these diamonds, it's easier to, kind of not buy everything and have a couple of gaps in here. So, once you start having gaps, maybe it doesn't kill you to play a card like this, if it's more like the 15th to 20th best starter, the way, if you're playing iron, you're never running your 20th best pitcher. Or at least you're never running the card that you think is the 20th best pitcher because you can always afford the better ones. But here, it's a little bit more viable to do that sometimes because people will play missing cards. But yeah, having said that, if I look for kind of someone with a really similar profile, let me see what we got here. Probably the closest, it's not a perfect analog, is something like this Woodruff, except Woodruff's a lot splittier, so that's why he's not such a good analog. Smith will play in PTCS. Okay, yeah, so I guess for an era-limited thing, then he certainly will play in PTCS because it's era-limited. That makes sense. Yeah, so he should play an era-limited thing. But yeah, otherwise, I think he just doesn't quite play. He's sort of fringy. So again, because it's diamond, these fringy cards probably are more like, or maybe I'll call it like an F plus, right? There's, and he does play in the era limited thing, as you said. All right, how about Tulowitzki? Well, the market seems to like the cards, so the market certainly seems to think this one plays. And of course, I've been desperate to get rid of Jeter, so I can see that. What do we actually think here? So you're getting 103 range, so you're getting kind of this excellent defensive shortstop. The bat is going to be worse than Jeter. The bat's going to be worse than Jackie. So the clubhouse Jackie is probably the biggest contender at the moment. And this is going to clearly have a better bat, but only the 96 range. So Tulowitzki is then the more defensive of the two. Notice that Jackie is shortstop only. Tulo is also shortstop only. So the combination of the two, it's going to be really difficult to play both. You have to pick, I think, at most the one or the other. And if you were running Jeter from the Mission, same deal, also shortstop only. So I think you only get one of them. Yeah, as for which one to pick, I think that comes down to your preference about glove versus bat. So my model does slightly prefer Jackie or Jeter over Tulo. However, this card is variant eligible and the others aren't. If you get the variant version of this, then it's just clearly the best of the three because they're pretty close to begin with, and you're getting that extra value. So from that point of view, that also is going to make this a pretty viable card. I think as is, it's in the mix. If this is the one you own, you probably play it. If one of the others is the one you own, you probably play it, and in neither case do you feel bad. So maybe it's just like a C, right? Yeah, Nomar was almost unplayable defensively on release, right? It was just that his bat was sort of so good that you maybe decided that you were willing to put up with it. But it is frustrating that, like defensively you can manage to get this Jeter, to barely work and not Nomar. Yeah, I completely agree. All right, how about Encarnacion? Um, let's see. So, yeah, another like pure power and eye type card. But this one at least has the avoid Ks to sort of survive in modern. Um, and can play first or third. And that's also going to be useful depending on, kind of what you're running. Because I think this card is viable at third. The glove is kind of good enough you can stick him there. You also can play him at first, but the thing is, at first, there's a good chance you're playing still like either the Hernandez from the launch mission, Giambi from the live missions. So he's kind of in the mix with these, but not clearly an upgrade. Or Berkman if you want to put him at first one way. This is also more of a two-way card. So I think this again is kind of in a similar spot to the Tulowitzki, where if you own the card, I think you can definitely find spots for him where he's going to be a natural part of the build and kind of should be starting. If you don't own the card, you can find probably some equally strong builds without this one and not feel like you're missing him. So I think there was this discussion about how you add diversity to the meta, and like whether variants or something would do it. But I think this is actually a really good example of how you do add diversity to the meta. You print a card like this where it looks a little bit different than some of the other things that are out there, but it's at almost exactly the same power level, so that you truly have something that feels like a choice. And I think this is a good addition from that point of view. Uh, the car as it stands, maybe like a C plus or something. Um, but just kind of, and I say this every week, but it's kind of worth reiterating. From my point of view, the most successful content are these B's and C's because, you know, as much as, like an S sort of seems, oh, it's a great card, an S isn't that interesting of a card. An S is basically a card that says, if it's an F, don't think about it, never touch it. If it's an S, don't think about it, just put one in your lineup and then stop thinking about it. You know, the cards like this, the cards that are the B's and C's, are the ones where you're really challenged to figure out sort of what you're supposed to do and what's the best path and how does this interact with the other stuff that you want to do to build and so forth. So for me, this kind of stuff is my favorite content each week. Uh, if I had to only own one of this or Molina, you know, obviously I'd own Molina, but I enjoy a card like this being printed more than I enjoy Molina, if that kind of makes sense. Um, all right, what do we got next? Suarez, right. So a little bit more versus righty, but he has that huge 158 power. I mean, versus lefty, he has that huge 158 power versus righties. Listed at third and short. This is clearly not a shortstop. This is a third baseman. You're never thinking about him at short. But this is a pretty good bat for a third baseman. So I've got him as the best VR bat for a third baseman at least. Um, when you include the defensive value, maybe he comes out still a little bit behind like the Rico Petrocelli or something, where you have him from the live missions probably, and his bat's a little worse, but a lot better glove. But this is going to be a really good bat. It's perfectly fine to print as a 99. I don't think he's a DH because there are just a couple of these great DH bats that can't go anywhere else. So there are too many first basemen, is where we were talking about. There's a little bit of a logjam there. So some of them you might be sticking at DH. A card like the Diamond Mickey Cochran, the bat's excellent. You could run him at catcher, but the glove's not great. You could sort of capture that value sticking him at DH, particularly if you had gotten a card like the Bismaki to fill, just to kind of fill missions or something. Then you could stick him at catcher. Um, or you run both and let Cochran be the backup, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think you got a few of these options. This again, this just does seem to be a couple steps behind the cards we looked at, though. So I think this one's probably more like a D plus. Again, you can find a build where if you own this card, you'll run him. Uh, so from that point of view, given that this one's an LE, I will say I'm a little bit surprised that this card is actually cheaper than yeah. Sorry, then I mean Encarnacion. That this card is actually cheaper than the Tulowitzki. Uh, I would have thought that kind of both are, you know, I would have thought that basically both are cards that, you know, will probably be upgrades if you don't have them, and will probably be skippable if you kind of, choose to upgrade elsewhere. But one's an LE, so I would have thought the LE would end up being the more expensive just for that reason, but I guess not. Um, all right, and then we got Stu Miller. So we had a really good gold Stu before. This has smaller splits than that one. That one was a pretty splitty card as well, although just overall incredibly strong. And of course, this one's up to a full diamond, and probably that's a little bit too high. So, this card's going to be behind like the Rivera, for example, who I guess is actually going to be incredibly expensive because of the mission, right? So this card's not getting cheaper anytime soon. This is actually shaped more like that excellent Stu Miller we had. A card like this, Doug Jones, I think probably will be a little better out of the pen, and then some of the converted starters as well. So, Miller's again probably fringy, probably something like a D. But I think this is one that you could have printed as a low diamond, and then it would have had a lot longer life and wouldn't really have hurt the card. Like it wouldn't have been overpowered as a low diamond, but it would have been, more steadily in play. All right, I got to remind myself to take a card like that Doug Jones or something and stick it on the roster because I think I noticed had a stale roster with some bad bullpen arms. All right, we got three perfects to kind of go through. So yeah, let's see what we got with our three perfects. Okay, so uh, first up we've got Helton. So this is a more balanced bat than some of the Heltons we've seen in the past, which I think is going to make him, it's going to make him much better as a two-way card, worse as a, you know, sort of one way. Um, so I do have him behind the PTCS Mattingly both ways, but at least in tournaments, because remember we talked a bit about the normalization, and a card like this, which is flat across the board, is incredibly sensitive to exactly where the normalization goes. Uh, so yes, Skyroll exactly, yeah. So that asterisk is basically Jerry Augustine right now is behind the live irons, but since we're about to have an update, it's just worth keeping an eye on it because if the live irons kind of change power level a bit or something like that, if any of those things happen, maybe the card jumps up a bit. If I just compare him with historicals, he's kind of in the frame, but he's behind the lives. And welcome, by the way. All right, so yeah, so Helton, he's going to be really sensitive to these normalizations, and that could go in either direction depending upon exactly what we've got there. He also does have this 101 range, so he's an excellent defensive first baseman. And I will say I am really tempted to just run this card at shortstop and see what happens. Uh, if I decide to buy one, I think I am going to run this card at shortstop and see what happens, actually. This seems like a really good card to kind of make that conversion. Um, but apart from that kind of silliness, it's still just a really good card. I mean, it's an excellent bat, and this 101 range is being wasted a bit, as a first baseman, right? Um, so he's behind Mattingly, but I think it's still like at least sort of an A or maybe even an A plus. I mean, they're only, I was gonna say 10, I guess six. No, there are 12 Mattinglys, right? That was the second place prize. Yeah, so 12 Mattinglys out there. So that, yeah, this card's probably then, an A plus. And I think it's fair to decide that you're not going to print something better than the PTCS reward yet. Um, but this is probably kind of in your next, in your next tier. Um, and actually, the more I think about, I mean, this is even sort of a two-way card, right? Yep, no, probably has longer legs than that. No, I think we can even give him like an S minus. Uh, yeah, we're gonna give him an S minus, and we're gonna say the S stands for shortstop. And I think you should try running him at shortstop and see if you can get that to work. If I get a copy, I definitely am gonna do that experiment. Um, all right, and then we got Red Faber. So, all right. PTCS eligible. I understand the point of that. Beyond the PTCS, this is probably pretty underpowered right now for uh, just for a full-on starter. Yeah. Um, like as a comparison, you know, well, okay, if you compare him to a card like the Satchel Paige, that was sort of this big mission reward. I mean, clearly Satchel has a lot more kind of everything. Um, but I mean, even okay, no, it's missing the P BABIP. I mean, it's almost like this Wilbur Cooper with more P BABIP. Um, yeah, it's almost this card with more P BABIP and the sides flipped or something. So it's kind of down there that level of power. Uh, Again, when you're looking at the league level, most people don't really just run the top 12 cards in a model because you can't afford to run the top 12 cards in a model. Um, so, from that point of view, uh, certainly if you have this card, you're running him. Um, but he's probably, yeah, I think I've got him about 15th, sort of, at least in tournaments among starters. And league, you're back to all these normalization issues in league. So you can think about kind of what he does from the normalization. So the more that people play low control cards and the control doesn't hurt him as much, the more that he might become a little bit more viable in league. Oh, yeah, yeah, sorry. He's eligible like weekly, like, for something open. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, in general, the PTCS, it's a weird choice of formats. Not only in terms of things being open, so like that's one take on the variant discussion. So you have a tournament that you're mainly qualifying for without needing the variants, but then you must have the variants to play the tournament. So that's one decision. But then also we have all these combined levels. And so in general, because the variants get you to specialize, if you're playing, let's say, a silver and gold combined level, for example, typically the people that qualify for that either qualify playing silver or qualify playing gold. Most of them are not qualifying playing a mix, uh, which is funny because I say that as someone that would play a mix just because I sort of play a little bit of everything. Um, yeah, or similar if you're an iron player, when you combine iron and bronze, right, you probably have either the irons or the bronzes. Okay. Um, but if you now have an open iron plus bronze tournament, that's a bronze tournament, right? Um, and so if you're an iron player, you don't have the cards. So I feel like if they were going to do this, they basically all need to be caps of some sort, so that you want a combination of cards from both levels. Uh, I guess you could instead decide to have a plan where you're going to do something like this, and then the next PTCS is just going to be an iron PTCS instead of a bronze one or something like that. I guess you could do something like that. Um, but see, this is still the reason that I think the PTCS should just be more of a series. With the several different tournament formats that combine different things and so forth. Um, anyway, but yeah, as for Faber, so yeah, it's probably something like a C minus, yeah, maybe closer to C minus. Uh, if you end up buying the card, you're unlikely to actually have 12 of the 15 or so cards that are better, so you're going to put them on your roster. Uh, at the same time, because there are 15 or so cards that are better, this is probably not a card that I want to go out of my way to pay a couple 100,000 points for, uh, because I can get some of the cards that are better more cheaply. You know, um, like as an example, would you rather have this card or you know or the Atlee Hammaker? I think you'd pretty clearly rather have Hammaker. Again, normalization can do funny things, but you'd pretty clearly rather have Hammaker in most situations. But Hammaker, just as a slightly older card, is half the price. So, go for Hammaker instead. So I think from that point of view, yeah, I'm not rushing out to get him, but if I have one, I'm going to find room for him, if that makes sense. Yeah, Toad would make sense. Yeah, there are a few of those. Toad would be up there. Jackson Jobe, Kevin Brown from release, the Sasaki from kind of the first set. Even a card like Tannehill, maybe in a lot of situations, you might prefer the lefty. Um, yeah, I mean, actually, I guess the best comparison in terms of power level, the shapes are a little different, is something like the Clubhouse Steve Carlton, and but actually, even the Clubhouse Carlton, I think you can get for a little bit under the 225 to 250 that Faber's going for right now. Um, Plus, I'd probably rather have the lefty, all things being equal. So yeah, I don't think I'm paying the current price for Faber, but I do think uh, but I do think he's got some value on a roster. So just in terms of the card quality, there's a reason to have him. All right, and finally, we've got the Babe, literally. So Yankee, F minus, and end of stream. Um, All right, I guess we should actually look at this one. I mean, he is yeah, sort of is a Red Sox too, right? Um, all right, fine. We'll look at the card. Okay. So in tournaments, this actually isn't that interesting of a card. It's a true outcome kind of thing. He obviously has a ton of power and a ton of eye. He will strike out a bunch. Um, in tournaments, this isn't so interesting, especially, because in open tournaments, you're going to have a bunch of these other options as well. And a good comparison is the card actually looks a lot like the live Aaron Judge, very slightly power crept up. And what we've seen from Judge is in tournaments, it really isn't that great of a card. However, in League, this is a card that can be at the top of the normalization in two different categories, in both power and eye. And that does make him a very strong hitter. So if you now think about what happens for Ruth, well, Ruth is now basically doing the same thing that Judge was doing, but he's ahead of him in both of those categories. So this is a, power crept version of the live Judge. And so I think this is going to be a viable league card for the same reason Judge is. Not such a good tournament card. Uh, so since I tend to focus on tournaments, my guess is I'm likely to skip him unless I pull one or something. But if I were focused on League, I think this is a card that I probably would want to have. So it's kind of in a funny spot from that point of view. Uh, so yeah, maybe the real rating is something like a C-ish. The other thing to keep track of is it does matter what happens next. And one of the things that's going to happen next is we're gonna get a re-rate from Judge as well. And uh, Judge actually could go up in some of these ratings, which would then also kind of push things a bit, right? So Sky Rule, yeah, I don't have enough for Tommy Green, but I did mention one big complaint on Tommy Green, which is I remember him as a player being one of the best hitting pitchers, like of that, you know, I don't want to say era because he only really played for a few years, but one of the best hitting pitchers, during that time. And these batting ratings are crazy when you look at, I mean, anything statistics based. So my sense was that, Tommy Green was sort of in the 20th-ish range or something. Just doesn't quite play. And, at Silver you can get all the ones ahead of him because they're all affordable. But I felt like Tommy Green was a really good chance to have sort of a sneaky two-way card from a more modern era. I mean, this is a guy that put up almost a full war of batting value uh, during 1991, the year of this card, just from the plate appearances that he was getting while pitching. Um, and I'm not quite sure what happened to get him these batting ratings because yeah, I mean, so you can look at his stats. Yeah, yeah, I'll put the baseball reference up and you can take a look. Like I said, take a look at the stats. And these are all like small sample sizes because it's a pitcher hitting. Uh, you know, and it's a pitcher hitting in the NL where you really tended to kind of get them out of the game early, especially that was one of these Jim Fregosi teams where he really was pulling the pitchers a bit earlier too. Uh, but yeah, if you look at those hitting statistics, I would have expected him to have a real bat. And I think if you gave him a real bat, yeah, yeah, I mean 19, yeah, so 19 hits, two of them home runs. So he actually two home runs, two doubles. So there's actually like a little bit of power and and gap power in there. 94 OPS plus coming out of your pitcher, right? Um, yeah, so I think these batting ratings don't make any sense, and you know, from Spore's point of view, I assume it's just something you don't look that closely at, right? The way I imagine that the cards get created is you start by auto creating them from the stats, then maybe you tweak the power level a little bit for what you want to release, and you're probably just not looking very closely at the hitting. Uh, but I'm surprised that whatever the auto import was doing didn't give him real hitting ratings because that should be just coming from the stats and like coming from these stats, these are much worse batting ratings than even poor hitting pitchers, right? So something weird happened when he was created. But yeah, feel free to ask. This would be an interesting one to ask and kind of see what they tell you about the creation process. Anyway, that's what we got for the set. Oh, we can do a TWIP draft. So I keep forgetting to do those. They never go well, as you all know. They never go well on stream. Let me enter live. They never go well on stream, no matter what we do. We've we've been doing these for at least a year, and they've never gone well. But this will be the week, right? So let's because I have an alt where literally the only thing it does is play Twipped, uh, just to be able to do it on stream. So we'll see how this goes. Um, so okay, yeah, I mean it's funny. There were a lot of these Fs. There were a lot of cards that just sort of had the wrong shape, but overall, I did think this was an interesting set. For me, the all these cards that I'm giving like a B or C to are the ones where I kind of have to think about them the most, and that's the most fun. Um, so, all right, we got our TWIP. Oh, if anyone has a suggestion for a team name for this week, for a funny team name, feel free to suggest it in the chat. We've kind of been changing this each week too, if we have a good idea. But let's see if we can actually get a TWIP draft to work here. So what do we have? 1948 Briggs Stadium. So power heavy from both sides, righty heavy, average. Okay. All right, let's see how it goes here. Um, well, it's probably not the worst start we've had. Oh, okay. Oh, actually, sorry. We're picking two cards. So if we're picking two cards, I guess it's straightforward, right? So Dotel, Sale, and Drysdale are sort of unplayable. Hendricks is actually a really good card, but we're not getting, a ton of early round value. Hartnett's a good card, but the catcher thing, so he gets fatigued easily. Valentin's just completely versus left. It's just not a good card versus righty. You know what? I think, yeah, because like Drysdale, I think Hendricks is actually the better call somehow. Well, see, Skyroll, every single week, you should see the VODs of these. Every single week, we get an awful slate of cards in TWIP. Just other drafts we do on stream, we've done great. We've had drafts that have won PTCSs and stuff on stream. TWIP specifically, every single week just somehow ends up atrocious. Yeah, I think it's Hendricks. I think normally I'd say you get so little value from the reliever that I want to take the mediocre starter. But because this is single elimination, having the reliever get one or two key appearances for you might be more important, even than like a third starter, because a lot of the time you're not making it to the third starter. So yeah, I think I'm gonna go with Hendricks. And it gets worse. Okay, so let's see. Um, okay, so this Perry, if lefties didn't exist, would still be bad, but lefties do exist. Bad launch card. Awful launch card. Much worse reliever. Okay. So, and I guess Wheeler, no, he's not going to be re-rated before this. So Wheeler is at least, he has no stamina, but we got to pick two. So it's going to be Wheeler. And it's going to be one of the two outfielders, right? So here's the comparison. And then defensively, yeah, I think we just take the 103 range and yeah. It's all right. There's the way these drafts always go. Okay. Well, we again don't have much in the way of meta cards. Okay. Ogilvy. So the problem is in a single elimination tournament, you're never really getting to the back end of the bullpen to take advantage of a guy like this where the only tool is power. I mean, this draft's almost already unworkable, isn't it? Yeah, this draft's almost already unworkable. But sure, let's. Okay, so Elliott's at least good versus lefties. That's his skill. So one option is we take Elliott and just pray that like we only face lefties. Miller Huggins, it's 89 range. I guess he has some turn double play, and he has no power in a power plus park. Uh, Boy. All right, we're taking Stu Miller because at least that's like a meta adjacent card. Wow. Huggins, I guess. We're just not going to face all left. Yeah. I guess you still maximize the chances of winning, although at this point, we're sort of 6 cards in and, we're pretty much 0 for 6. So it's going to be rough to, yeah. But all right. Okay, well, here we go. So Benintendi at least is, there's a real bat versus righties. So that's a legitimate card. Well, here we can get a bad clubhouse star card. So, but you can compare it with this Kashner, and yeah, probably in this park, Kashner is what we want instead. So, Kashner may well be our game 1 starter. Yeah. Yeah, Buster has pop and he technically pitches, but look, this draft's already busted. This is the way these all work, but we'll play it out and see how it goes. All right, Schilling's at least like meta adjacent. Now the problem with Nelly Fox is that we took Huggins, who's second base only. Maybe we're supposed to take Nelly anyway. You can go short on backups in a single elimination tournament because, let's be honest, we don't really need 5 starters because there's no way this team is getting to game 5. So we could go Nelly. Ventura, has that infield defense. Uh, it doesn't matter at this point. Sure, let's go Ventura. It doesn't matter. Wow. Um, okay. So Trevino is at least he has this 101 framing, and so like we can just stick him in as a backup catcher because it's a card that has a spot on the roster. And then we need a second one of these. And I guess is it gonna be Hardy who can only play versus lefties and only play one position? It's probably gonna be. It's gonna be yeah. That's it's 102 range and yeah. Um this really happens every week when we do these Twift drafts. Wow. This actually, especially given that it's a 12 card round, this might be the worst round we've had yet. All right, I'm going to ask the chat. Is there any card out of these 12? Are there any of these 12 cards one that you actually draft, like or have drafted in something? I'm trying to think if I've ever. Uh, okay, so Luke Weaver probably no, but he's even a home run plus park. I mean, that isn't even going to work. Um, wow. I mean, yeah, it just works out every week with this. This is it's part of the fun of doing these on stream. All right, I'm guessing it's this Carl Weilman, maybe. Maybe we're supposed to take the huge P Babbitt guy and just hope we get the good die rolls. Um, Gates Brown is a one-way bat. I think okay. I think we're taking Gates Brown as our DH. Vernon versus left, except that we don't have any lefties to face is the problem. You know what? Let's try. All right, let's do this. We're taking Gates Brown and Vernon Wells, and that's going to be a DH platoon. Let's try it. All right. Um, okay. So we have three completely unplayable historicals. Okay, Sanchez is one of the better live options, hoping that we don't face that many righties, I guess. And then Payante must be, look, he's going to keep the ball in the ballpark. So I think we're going with our two live pitchers. And look, the truth is these are our fourth and fifth starters, and I think we can tell by now that this team is not going to need its fourth and fifth starters. Um, Okay, well, you know what? We did say that Al Wicklund was draftable, so we've got a draftable player. Um, and Seth Lugo at least has kind of a decent shape for one of these lives, right? I guess. Um, um, I don't think it matters much here what we do. All right. Okay, so Darwin Barney, at least, with the 103 range, like this is a card that can have a use on a roster in single elimination tournaments, I guess. Um, and what do we got? Huh. Guess Clevenger is just going to get swallowed up by righties even too much, isn't he? Uh, I don't know. Um, okay, maybe we just take. I mean, taking Beatty is a real admission that just like nothing's coming out of this. But yeah, maybe that's yeah. All right. We're not doing a lot better at pulling any of these even remotely meta bronze cards, are we? All right. That's a pitcher, and that's a pitcher. Let's well, Adzale is probably the better shape. It really doesn't matter. Yeah, exactly. Give us a concede button, please. This is just it's funny because like I've done other drafts on stream, they're fine. Every single week, the TWIP draft on this stream is just atrocious. Uh, we've never actually had a good one somehow, and we've been doing this for probably close to 2 years. It's just fun at this point. All right. So the good news is we got a card that we've seen in metas. The bad news is it's Ozzy Virgil, and we've already got two catchers. Okay, Albies is at least a really good live. And sure, you're a pitcher. Why not? I don't think it matters at this stage. You aren't even a pitcher. Fine. Solano has a bat. Logan Allen's a pitcher. I think we can just give up on this at this point. There's a good reason the team's called first round bye, right? But you know what we are going to do? We're going to pick a fun strategy. Let's go with the fictional general manager settings Spanish strategy. I'm sort of feeling that one this week. Ooh, very nice. We have maxed everything. We bench hitters at 32%, starters at 71%, and relievers at 101%. Uh, yes, 101%. uh, and we allow pinchers when tied. Oh, yeah, you know what? Let's try this. Why not? What's the worst that could happen? If this team somehow wins like 3 or 4 rounds, I don't know. Yeah, oops, all bunts. um, yeah, oops, all bunts. All right. Okay, well that was fun. I think that's a good point to call it a stream. Is there anybody, or actually any last things before we kind of wrap up? But then also, I see there are a few people that I've seen in chat that often stream, including a couple late at night. Were any of you planning on getting a stream going that you want me to raid into? If so, if not, it looks like Ezra Denny's up, so I can raid him. But if anyone in chat was kind of about to get a stream going, I'm happy to raid you instead. You know what? Hold on. Let's just to show that we can actually occasionally get players. Let's do one more draft while I'm waiting to see if there's anyone to raid into. Um, let's do one better draft here, just to. All right. Okay. Hey, we actually got like options. Okay, aspirin every day, Hartnett available. That's actually closer, isn't it? I think aspirin because we get more play. It's actually close. Yeah, I think aspirin because we get more play, but that's close. All right, Mondesi is doable. Yeah, see now we actually have like cards that are useful and like several legitimate options. And yeah, probably it's Piper at this point, but again, they're like three viable options. Okay. He's like an actual card. He's an actual card. See, I'm telling you, it's just the TWIP draft where just every single week the TWIP draft just kind of ends up nuts. I'm not quite sure kind of how it gets there. I can even take Rusty as a DH here because we sort of have some options. Yeah, Hamels is fine, and a few different options here. Probably it's supposed to be one of the relievers, but yeah, yeah, probably supposed to be one of the relievers. Yeah, he's kind of meta adjacent. He's a really good live that you're probably starting at some points. Um, yeah, Glass is even fine. Okay, so just to show you, we can actually get viable cards. See, we even could go. See, now we have room for Vernon Wells, even, right? Could platoon him with Staub. Um, or maybe, yeah, Double E. Okay, we mentioned earlier, Heal earlier on stream, even as an example of kind of, one of these good live bronzes. We could make this a catcherless draft. That's always fun. Um, if we don't, I'm going to have to still take some pretty soon. But there are some fun catcherless strategies. Let me think if we want to go catcherless here. Um, Wait, hold on. Can we go catcherless actually? Or do some of these players? Okay, no, we can go catcherless. Um, it is true. Three of the same cards got offered, but we got some good ones. All right. Let's see how. Well, you know what? We didn't really get enough good cards to want to go catcherless, did we? Because if we had gotten like a ton of meta cards without the good catchers, I think this would have been sort of a fun catcherless draft, but we just didn't. So think we go catcher, and all right. So there you go. So just so you see, it is possible to actually get like viable meta cards and all that in a draft on stream. It is, you know, it is actually just fine. It is just not possible to do that. That's a weird auto configuration, isn't it? Okay, so it wants to run Bonifacio and left. Rather, that's interesting. Hmm. You know what? Whatever. I think for these quicks, it's kind of fun to let the computer decide. No stakes involved. We'll see how the computer does, but I think you're making a mistake running Bonifacio there. Um, I mean, you force better bats to play catcher, but also the drop off behind the plate maybe isn't quite as much as you'd think. Um, kind of in the same way that I was saying that forcing Helton to play shortstop could be fun because he has that 101 range. Um, anyway, all right, I think there's a good point to stop then. So if no one else is firing up a stream, let's go raid into Ezra Denny. Yeah, thanks everyone. One of these Friday nights I will be around a little earlier, I hope, but it just hasn't, things have been busy. And then next week I'm at a conference, so there will probably be no stream, and that's also why I'm not gonna do all this micro stuff for PTCS, even though, like with the stamina thing as we discussed, it's probably better. Um, but if they don't fix it by PTCS 3, I will be running 9 starters and all that. So but I really hope they fix it, and I really hope they fix it by PTCS too. So anyway, great. Thanks everyone. Let's go raid Ezra. Say hi to him for me, and I will catch you all in 2 weeks then.